The little girl was barefoot in the snow, 6 years old, arms stretched wide, standing in the headlights of 180 motorcycles like she was daring God and gravity both to blink first. Gideon Rohr had survived 3 combat deployments, 2 federal investigations, and a knife fight that left him with 4 inches of scar tissue across his left rib cage. He had never, not once, in 51 years of living hard and sleeping harder, hit the brakes for anything that scared him. He hit them now. And in the 3 seconds of silence that followed, engines dropping to idle, snow screaming sideways off the ocean, his scouts found enough military-grade explosive beneath that bridge to erase every name in his brotherhood from the earth. The child had saved them all. He just didn't know yet what saving them was going to cost her. Before we ride any further, if this story already has your chest tight and your finger hovering, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next in this universe. Drop a like if you're riding with us tonight and tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels, because the road ahead is long, and what happens next to this little girl and these broken men is going to wreck you in the best possible way. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The memorial ride had always been the Iron Saints' most sacred obligation and their most dangerous one, 180 motorcycles, one coastal highway. One night every year when they rode in formation through whatever weather November decided to throw at them, because the men whose names were stitched into the back of their vests had ridden in worse. The dead deserved nothing less than discomfort from the living. Gideon roared from the front the way he always had, the way he'd been leading things since he was 23 years old, and the army decided his instincts were sharp enough to point at other human beings. His Harley Road King was black from tank to pipes, no chrome, no decoration, except a single iron cross bolted to the handlebars. Not a symbol of anything except weight. He liked the reminder. Weight kept you honest. The storm had rolled in off the Atlantic around 9 in the evening, not the gentle kind that turned the harbor town into a postcard, but the grinding, lateral kind that came in off open water and hit you like a wall of wet concrete. His visor was iced at the corners. His left hand, the one that had taken shrapnel outside Kandahar in 2009 and never fully closed again, was burning inside its glove despite the heated grip. He flexed it rhythmically, the way the VA therapist had once told him to, though he'd stopped seeing the therapist 4 years ago when she'd suggested his nightmares were a trauma response, and not, as he'd argued, accurate memories. Behind him, the formation stretched nearly a quarter-mile along Highway 9, headlights cutting through the horizontal snow like a chain of cold fire. He could hear them in his bones even through the wind. That particular harmonic of displacement engines running in close formation felt more than heard, a vibration that lived in the sternum. 179 other men and 2 women who had chosen this particular tribe and this particular obligation, riding in weather that had already closed the harbor road to civilian traffic. His VP, a man named Cortez, who had ridden with him since Gideon was still young enough to think recklessness was a personality trait, came up on his left and held position without speaking. That was the thing about Cortez. 17 years of riding together, and the man had refined communication down to proximity and posture. Right now, his posture said he didn't love the road conditions. Gideon's posture said neither did he. The bridge came up on the GPS 3 minutes before it appeared in the headlights. Calhoun Crossing. 400 feet of single-lane concrete spanning the inlet, 40 feet above water, that was black and moving fast with the storm surge. The bridge was old, built in the early 50s, patched twice by county contractors who'd billed 3 times what the work was worth. Gideon had crossed it every year for 11 years. He knew the way it rumbled under the weight of the formation, the way the guardrails shook, the particular hollow thud of the expansion joints. He was doing exactly that calculation: weight, speed, spacing, whether to take them across in 2 groups. When his headlights hit her, she was standing exactly at the threshold of the bridge approach, where the highway narrowed and the guardrails began. Bare feet on frozen pavement, a nightgown that had probably been white before the storm got to it. She couldn't have weighed 50 pounds. Her arms were stretched out to her sides, perpendicular to her body, palms flat, not waving, not gesturing, just out, the way a small person makes themselves as large as possible when they have run out of other options. Gideon's hand hit the brake before his mind finished forming the thought. The formation responded in a cascade. Not panic, these were trained riders, but a controlled compression, 200 feet of motorcycles folding down to a hard stop, with the kind of practiced precision that only came from years of riding together. He heard Cortez lock up behind him, heard the formation rattle and compress, heard nothing that sounded like a collision. Then silence, except for the storm. Gideon was off the bike in one motion, helmet up, crossing the distance to the child in 7 strides. She was still standing with her arms out. Her feet were blue. Not figuratively. The skin had gone the color of a bruise, and he could see her shaking from 10 feet away. But her jaw was set in a way that had nothing to do with a 6-year-old's expression. It was an adult kind of stubborn, learned stubborn, the kind that came from having been scared too many times to be scared of one more thing. He stopped 4 feet from her and crouched down to eye level. Her eyes were gray, or maybe the storm made them gray. They were fixed on him with an intensity that went straight past his defenses and hit something he hadn't known was still alive in there. "You need to not go on the bridge," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "Okay," he said. "There's something under it." He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then he straightened up, turned back to the formation, and put 2 fingers to his mouth. The whistle cut through the storm, and Cortez was already moving before the echo died, pulling Raker and Dowd from the column. The 2 men who had combat engineering experience and whose instincts Gideon trusted more than most federal agencies. He turned back to the girl. "What's your name?" "Maisie." "How old are you, Maisie?" 6 3/4. "You got somewhere to be?" She pointed back down the highway, away from the bridge, into the dark. "My mom doesn't know I left." "Where's your mom?" "The Harbor Inn, room 6. He nodded. "You cold?" She looked down at her feet like she was just now noticing them. "A little." He unzipped his cut. The leather was cold on the outside and warm from his body on the inside, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It hit her at the ankles and the sleeves dragged on the pavement. She looked down at it, then back up at him, and something in her face shifted. Not relief. Something older than relief. "You're going to listen," she said. Not a question. "I'm listening," he said. She nodded once, as if that confirmed something she'd needed confirmed, and then she sat down on the frozen pavement inside his cut and waited, with the particular patience of a child who had learned that adults needed time to understand what was directly in front of them. It took Raker 11 minutes. He came back across the bridge threshold at a jog, which was not an expression Gideon had seen on Raker's face in 6 years of riding together. Raker had diffused IEDs in Fallujah and had opinions about people who described things as stressful. The jog told Gideon everything before the man opened his mouth. "Semtex," Raker said, "military grade, packed into the 3rd expansion joint from this end and the 2 center support columns. Remote detonated. Whoever placed it, new load distribution." He paused. "Giddy. If we'd taken the full formation across that bridge, I know. We'd have lost the whole center 3rd on the first blast, the rest with the collapse. There's no surviving that at 40 feet above. I know, Raker." Silence. Cortez came to stand beside them both and looked down at Maisie, who was sitting on the pavement looking at the bridge with the particular expression of a child who had done the thing she came to do and was now simply tired. "She just walked out," Cortez said quietly. "Yeah." "Barefoot." "Yeah." Cortez looked at Gideon. "How'd she know?" Gideon looked at Maisie. "Maisie." She looked up. "How did you know about the bridge?" Something moved across her face. A calculation. The kind of calculation that did not belong on a 6-year-old's face, and the fact that it did belong there, that it was clearly practiced, clearly habitual, landed in Gideon's chest like a stone dropping into cold water. "My dad told me," she said. "Before." "Before what?" She looked away from him, back toward the bridge, and the conversation closed like a door. Gideon did not push. He had learned, in a life that had required significant learning, that some doors opened on their own schedule or not at all. He called back into the formation, got the word moving through the column that they were rerouting, and called County Emergency Services to report an explosive device on Calhoun Crossing. The dispatcher sounded skeptical. He gave her Raker's full name, his own full name, and the coordinates, and told her that if the bomb squad wasn't on scene within 40 minutes, there would be a conversation about departmental negligence that she would not enjoy. Then he picked Maisie up off the pavement, cut and all, and carried her back toward the formation. She did not protest. She tucked her blue feet against his side and held onto his collar with both hands, and looked over his shoulder at the bridge as he walked away from it. And whatever she was thinking stayed entirely on the inside. The Harbor Inn was 4 blocks from the rerouted highway, a 2-story building with a vacancy sign that flickered on the left side and a parking lot that hadn't been plowed since Tuesday. The main office was staffed by a man in his 60s who looked at 180 motorcycles pulling into his lot with an expression that suggested he was reviewing his retirement timeline. Room 6 was ground floor, east end of the building. Gideon knocked, stepped back so she could see him through the peephole without it being threatening, which was a calculation he'd gotten good at making, given what he looked like and what he was. The door opened on a chain. The woman behind it was maybe 32, 33. Dark circles that went past tired into something structural. Hair pulled back in the way of someone who had stopped thinking about hair. She was wearing a sweatshirt with a college logo on it, 3 sizes too large, and she was holding a phone in one hand and a room key in the other. And when she saw Maisie's face over his shoulder, she made a sound that Gideon recognized, the specific sound of a parent's fear converting instantly to relief, and then back to fear again when the relief reminds them how scared they just were. The chain came off. The door opened. Maisie? Her voice cracked on it. She was on her knees on the threshold, pulling the girl to her, and Maisie went without resistance, but she reached back with one hand and kept hold of Gideon's collar for a moment, the way a child keeps hold of something they're not ready to let go of yet. Then she let go. The woman looked up at Gideon over her daughter's shoulder. Her eyes moved to his cut, the Iron Saints patch, the president's rocker, and he watched the sequence of expressions cross her face. Fear, assessment, decision. She went out alone, the woman said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of a thing she couldn't afford to fully process right now. She stopped us from crossing a bridge, Gideon said. There was an explosive device underneath it. My guys called it in. The road's closed. The woman went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of a person receiving confirmation of something they already feared. How did she know? She said, and her voice had gone flat in a way that suggested she already knew the answer and was asking to confirm that he didn't, which would tell her how much she needed to say. She said her dad told her, Gideon said. Before. The flatness in her voice deepened. Her arms tightened around Maisie. You'd better come in, she said. Then she stopped herself. She looked past him at the parking lot, at the impossible fact of 180 motorcycles sitting in the snow, engines ticking as they cooled, their riders standing or sitting in absolute silence, waiting. All of you can't? Just me, Gideon said. She stepped back from the door. The room was what Harbor Inn rooms were. 2 beds, a desk, a bathroom with caulk that needed replacing. There was a duffel bag on the floor that had been repacked in a hurry, and a pair of children's shoes sitting by the door with the laces still tied, which meant Maisie had left without untying them, which meant she'd left in enough of a hurry that she'd left her shoes. On the desk was a laptop, closed. Next to it was a manila envelope that had been opened and resealed badly, the flap lifting at one corner. Gideon did not look at these things directly. He had learned that looking at things directly told people you were interested, and when people knew you were interested, they started deciding what to hide. He sat in the single chair. The woman sat on the edge of the bed nearest the door, Maisie in her lap, the girl's eyes already going heavy with exhaustion, the particular crash of a child's body after an enormous expenditure of will. Elena, the woman said, her name offered without being asked for, which meant she'd decided something about him already. Gideon, he said. She looked at his hands, the scarred one, the way it sat in his lap. Military, she said. Was. My husband was, too. She said it in past tense with the same flatness as everything else, the flatness of a person who had gone over this information so many times that it had worn smooth. Danny, he died 4 months ago. I'm sorry. It wasn't an accident, she said. I know that sounds like... She stopped, started again. They said it was a single vehicle accident on Route 12. His car went off the road near the old mill property. No skid marks, no mechanical failure the report could identify. He wasn't drinking, he hadn't slept much, but he didn't. She stopped again. He'd been looking into something, a land development deal that went through the county commissioners 2 years ago. Private coastal land, rezoned, sold at a fraction of assessment value to a development company out of Portland. Except the development company was a shell. And the land, she looked down at Maisie's hair. The land runs right along the bridge approach, the old bridge approach, and the new proposed highway corridor. Gideon sat with that for a moment. Your husband was documenting this, he said, for months. He had files. On his laptop, on a drive. She pressed her mouth together. His laptop wasn't in the car when they found it. His phone was there, but the data had been wiped. I reported it. The sheriff's department said they'd look into it. She looked at Gideon with the gray, used-up expression of a woman who had stopped expecting anything from the word department. That was 4 months ago. Gideon said nothing. Outside, the storm pressed against the window with a sound like breathing. Under the table, next to the duffel bag, he could see the corner of a child's drawing, crayon on construction paper, the bright primary colors that 6-year-olds used before they learned that the world was more complicated than primary colors. She's been afraid since he died, Elena said quietly, looking down at the girl who was now fully asleep in her lap. She doesn't sleep well. She has these dreams, she calls them, but they're... She exhaled. He used to talk to her, Danny. He told her things he shouldn't have, not because he was careless, but because she's the kind of kid you forget is 6, because she listens like an adult. He told her about the bridge. He told her it was important. He told her... She stopped. What did he tell her? Gideon said. Elena looked at him for a long time. He told her that if anything ever happened to him, and if anyone ever came near that bridge with a lot of people, she should stop them. Her voice had gone very quiet. He told her to be brave enough to stop them, that his job was to be a protector, and she had to help him finish it. The room was very silent. Gideon looked at the sleeping child. He thought about a man, dead 4 months, his laptop gone, his phone wiped, his death filed as an accident, who had known enough about what was coming to prepare a 6-year-old girl to run barefoot into the headlights of a biker convoy in a blizzard. He thought about who would build a bomb capable of taking out a bridge support column, and who would have both the motive and the access to place it there without the county noticing, and what kind of operation required that level of planning, and what that level of planning implied about the people running it. He thought about the fact that the bombing had been designed to kill everyone on the Iron Saints Memorial Ride, which meant someone had known the route, which meant someone had been watching, which meant... His phone buzzed. Cortez. He stepped outside without explanation. Cortez was standing at the edge of the parking lot, collar up, snow in his beard, holding his phone out. The screen showed a photograph. Found this zip tied to the back of your bike, Cortez said. Raker spotted it when he was checking the formation. The photograph was a printed image, slightly blurred, taken from a distance with a long lens. It showed Gideon's Road King, his plate, the Iron Saints formation on Highway 9, taken at least 2 hours ago, before the storm had thickened, before they'd reached the bridge. Before anyone outside the Brotherhood should have known their route, someone had been tracking them. And the photograph had been left on his bike afterward, not as intelligence, but as a message that said, we know where you are, we know who you are, and we're not finished. Gideon looked at the image for a long moment. Then he handed the phone back to Cortez and looked at the formation, 179 men and 2 women, sitting in the snow, engines cold, waiting for whatever came next. We're not riding out tonight, he said. Cortez didn't argue. How long? Don't know yet. Gideon looked back at room 6. The curtain had shifted, and for a moment he thought he saw Maisie's face in the gap, watching him from the dark. But when he looked directly, there was nothing there, just the reflection of snow. There's a little girl in that room, he said, whose dead father dismantled enough of a conspiracy to get himself killed, and whoever killed him just tried to kill us on the same road. He paused. Which means she's the only witness left. And they know she's here. Cortez was quiet for a moment. So what do we do? Gideon pulled his cut back on over the thermal he'd been left wearing since Maisie had his jacket. The leather was cold now, but it settled onto his shoulders with the familiar weight of something that had been through worse. We do what we always do, he said. We park the bikes and we stay between her and whatever's coming. He turned back toward room 6. He was 3 steps from the door when his phone rang. Unknown number, which normally he didn't answer, but something about tonight had recalibrated his instincts, and he picked up. Static. Then a voice. Male. Controlled. The kind of controlled that took practice. President Roar, the voice said, I suggest you leave the Hollow Girl to people who understand what's at stake. You're a long way from home, and this road gets considerably more dangerous after midnight. The call ended. Gideon stood in the snow with the phone in his scarred hand and the storm coming in off the Atlantic and 179 people waiting on his word. He thought about the man on the phone, the precision of President Roar, of Hollow Girl, of considerably more dangerous after midnight. And he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent years operating in environments where clarity was the difference between breathing and not, that whoever had placed that bomb, and whoever had left that photograph, and whoever had just called him, knew exactly who he was, exactly where he was, and exactly what he was protecting. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was what it cost to make Gideon Roar leave. He put the phone in his pocket and pushed open the door to room 6. Elena looked up. She read something in his face that made her go still. They called you, she said. Yes. And? He sat back down in the chair, looked at the sleeping child, looked at the manila envelope on the desk with its lifting corner. Your husband's name, he said. What was his full name? Elena blinked. Daniel Roar Hollow. He went by Danny. She paused. He hyphenated when we married. His mother's name was Hollow. His father's was Roar. She looked at Gideon. Why? The name landed in Gideon's chest like something physical. Roar. He hadn't spoken to his father's brother's family in over 20 years. He hadn't thought about them in nearly as long. His branch of the family had gone one direction, military, then roads, then leather and iron, and the other branch had gone quiet, the way families went quiet when they scattered. Daniel Roar Hollow, his cousin, his dead cousin, whose daughter had run barefoot into his headlights, whose daughter was the only thing standing between a conspiracy and its final silence. The storm outside pressed harder against the glass, and somewhere down the harbor road, past the checkpoints and the cold and the darkness, something that had been set in motion a long time ago was still moving, and Gideon Roar, who had stopped for a child in the snow and in doing so inherited her war, was only now beginning to understand what he had actually ridden into tonight. The envelope on the desk had lifted at the corner again, as if the room itself was breathing, and from behind the curtain, Gideon was certain this time, 2 gray eyes were watching him, steady and patient and already several steps ahead. The envelope had been sitting on that desk for 4 months. Gideon knew this the way he knew most things that mattered. Not from being told, but from the way Elena's eyes moved to it and away from it in the same involuntary reflex, the way a person's eyes move to a wound they were trying not to touch. She'd carried it from wherever Danny died to wherever she'd gone next. And then here, to this room with its bad caulk and its flickering vacancy sign, and she hadn't opened it the rest of the way because opening it the rest of the way meant something she wasn't ready for yet. The envelope, Gideon said. Elena's jaw tightened. It was in his things, she said, the ones they released to me after. A pause. After. You haven't opened it. I opened it. She looked at her hands. I looked at the first page and I put it back. What was on the first page? She was quiet for a long moment. Maisie shifted in her sleep, made a small sound, resettled. Elena smoothed the girl's hair with the mechanical tenderness of a person whose hands had learned to comfort even when the rest of her had forgotten how. His handwriting, she said finally, and a date. 3 days before he died. Gideon said nothing. He let the silence work. He wrote my name at the top, Elena said. And then he wrote, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back from Route 12. And She stopped, pressed her mouth together. I couldn't read the rest. Not yet. Gideon looked at the envelope. Can I? She looked at him for a long time. That same assessment she'd done at the door, that same calculation, and then she nodded once, the kind of nod that cost something. He crossed to the desk and picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. He lifted the flap carefully and removed the contents. 11 pages of yellow legal paper, front and back, Danny's handwriting in black ballpoint, dense and slightly cramped. The handwriting of a man who wrote fast because he had a lot to say and wasn't sure how much time he had to say it. He started reading. Danny had been careful, patient, methodical in a way that Gideon recognized from men who'd done intelligence work. You built the picture from the outside in. You documented everything. You cross-referenced. You never assumed. He'd started with the land deal, 42 acres of coastal property sold through a county commissioner vote that had been scheduled on a Friday afternoon in August, when half the county offices were running skeleton staff. The development company, Harrow Coastal Holdings, LLC, had incorporated in Delaware 18 months before the purchase, capitalized at exactly the minimum required to bid. The purchase price was $1.2 million for land the county's own assessor had valued at $4.7 million the previous year. That alone was irregular. What came next was worse. Harrow Coastal Holdings had two named officers, both of whom dissolved into shell structures when Danny tried to trace them back. But the registered agent, the legal entity responsible for receiving court documents, was a law firm in Portland, and one of that firm's senior partners had donated $85,000 to the county commissioner's re-election campaign in the same calendar year as the land purchase, spread across 17 separate individual donations just under the reporting threshold. Danny had documented every one. Then he'd pulled the building permits, or tried to. There were permits on file for a luxury residential development, engineer's stamps, drainage plans, a traffic study. But when Danny had driven out to the property in June, 6 months after the permits were filed, there was no construction, no cleared land, no equipment, just 42 acres of coastal property behind a new chain-link fence with private security cameras that shouldn't have been there for a residential development. He'd started asking around after that, quietly at first. The harbor master, who'd been there 30 years, told him the land had something to do with a pipeline survey from the early 90s, mineral rights maybe, or tidal access. A retired county engineer told him off the record that the drainage permits didn't make sense for residential construction. The load calculations were wrong for houses, but right for something that needed a deep foundation and a reinforced floor. And then Danny had found the bridge connection. Calhoun Crossing, the bridge Maisie had stopped the Iron Saints from crossing tonight, sat directly on the primary access route to the Harrow property. Any heavy equipment, any large-scale materials movement, anything that needed to get to that land in volume had to cross that bridge or take a 30-mile detour on back roads. Danny had pulled the bridge inspection reports. The most recent one, filed 8 months ago, showed the structure as sound. But the engineer who'd signed it had retired the following month with a pension that Danny had traced, laboriously, through public records, to a lump sum payment from a benefits account associated with, not Harrow Coastal Holdings, but a second company. A company called Meridian Infrastructure Partners. Meridian Infrastructure Partners. Not in Delaware. Registered in Virginia. Near enough to the Beltway. That it wasn't geography anymore. It was a postcode for a particular kind of relationship. Gideon set the pages down on the desk. He stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the wood, and the storm outside and the sleeping child behind him, and the weight of 11 pages settling into the space behind his sternum where the old shrapnel scar was. Military contractors. Not local corruption. Not a county commissioner with his hand in a development deal. Something that reached into Virginia. Something with the vocabulary of infrastructure and the appetite of money that had learned to move in the dark. He turned around. Elena was watching him. He knew what he was into, Gideon said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said, and he kept going anyway. Her chin lifted slightly. He was that kind of man. Gideon nodded slowly. He thought about what kind of man spent months building a paper trail on a conspiracy with military contractor connections, and then, 3 days before he died, wrote a letter to his wife that started with, "If you're reading this." Not paranoid, not dramatic, prepared. The way soldiers got prepared when they understood the terrain and didn't like their odds, but couldn't walk away from the objective. He thought about the name on the file. Roar. He had not told Elena yet. He wasn't sure why. Not dishonesty, but something more complicated. The kind of pause a person took when they were about to say something that would change the shape of a room permanently. His phone buzzed. Cortez again. He stepped outside. The parking lot had transformed in the past hour. The formation had broken, not scattered, but reorganized with the quiet efficiency that happened when experienced men understood. A situation had changed and adjusted without being told. 6 bikes were positioned at the lot entrances. 4 more were parked along the building's east wall, riders still mounted, engines off but eyes moving. Raker was at the far end of the lot with Dowd and a man named Priest, who had done 2 tours as a Marine scout and now ran the Iron Saints intelligence operations, with the same meticulous economy he'd applied to everything since coming home. Cortez met him halfway across the lot. "Priest found something," Cortez said. "Talk." He ran the plate on a gray Silverado that's been sitting on the road outside since we pulled in. It's been there since before we arrived, registered to a private security company out of Portland, Harrow Security Solutions. He paused. "You recognize that name?" "Yes." Cortez absorbed that without expression. Priest also picked up a radio frequency about 20 minutes ago. Encrypted, short burst, coming from the direction of the marina. He can't decode it, but the transmission pattern is military standard, not local law enforcement. Gideon looked at the road. The Silverado was there, exactly where Cortez said, sitting in the dark with its lights off and its engine running. He could see the exhaust in the cold air. "They're watching the room," Gideon said. Ian said, "Yeah." "How many you count?" "That truck, at minimum 2. There's a second vehicle Priest thinks he spotted on the service road behind the inn. Can't confirm yet." Gideon stood in the snow and thought about angles. The room had 1 door and 1 window. The window faced the parking lot. The door opened onto the covered walkway that ran along the ground floor. If someone wanted to reach Elena and Maisie without going through the parking lot, the service road was the only option, which meant if Priest was right about the second vehicle, they'd already thought about that. "Put 2 on the service road," he said. "Raker stays with me. Everyone else holds position." He paused. "Nobody moves on that truck unless they move first. I don't want an incident that gives local law enforcement an excuse to clear us out." Cortez nodded. Then, "Giddy," something in his tone. "What?" "About 12 of the guys, but Holt, Brenner, the Yuma chapter guys, they want a conversation." Gideon looked at him. "They're not wrong," Cortez said carefully. "We came up here for the memorial ride. We're now parked in a motel lot in a blizzard with a military-grade explosive situation and what sounds like private military contractors watching a room with a kid in it. Some of them have families, some of them have prior conditions with law enforcement that don't benefit from—" "I know," Gideon said. "I'm not saying they're wrong." "I know you're not." He looked at the door to room 6. "Give me 10 minutes with Holt." Cortez nodded and moved off. Gideon stood alone for a moment in the snow, the cold coming up through his boots from the pavement, the storm working at the collar of his cut. He could feel the formation's attention on him even through the dark and the weather. That particular pressure of collective watching, the way a group of men who had chosen to follow someone looked at that someone when the situation turned sideways and waited to see if the reason they'd followed him was still there. He'd felt this pressure before. Rock. FOB outside Mosul, 2007. 12 men waiting to see if the information they'd received was worth the route they'd have to take. He'd made the call. 3 of those men had not come home. He had, and he'd been paying for that arithmetic ever since. He went to find Holt. Holt was one of the founding members of the Iron Saints Yuma chapter, a former corrections officer with 4 arms like bridge cable and a practical intelligence that Gideon had always respected. He was standing with Brenner and 4 others near the east end of the lot, smoking, and the smoke rose in a straight column in the brief pause the wind took before starting again. Holt looked at him when he approached. Not hostile, assessing. "Talk to me," Gideon said. Holt took a drag. Exhaled. "This isn't our fight." "No," Gideon said. "It's not." Holt blinked. He'd expected an argument. "It's a 6-year-old girl's fight," Gideon said. "She ran barefoot into our headlights and stopped us from getting blown off a bridge. That makes it our fight whether we want it to be or not, because we are now the only thing between her and the people who put that bomb there, and those people know we're here and know we know about them, which means our options are leave and hope they don't decide we're a loose end, or stay and make sure they can't move on her." Silence. "Her father's name was Daniel Roar Hollow," Gideon said. "His mother was Roar, same branch as my father's family." He let that sit for a moment. "She's family, which makes the child family, which means I'm not leaving." Holt looked at him for a long moment. Then he dropped the cigarette on the wet pavement and turned to the four men with him, and something passed between them that didn't require words. The same wordless accounting that happened between men who had made hard decisions together before and knew the texture of each other's judgment. "Yuma stays," Holt said. Gideon nodded. "Anyone who needs to go, goes. I'm not holding anyone." Nobody moved. He hadn't expected them to. That was the thing about this particular tribe that he could never adequately explain to anyone who hadn't been part of one. It wasn't allegiance to him exactly, or even to the Brotherhood's formal codes. It was something older and less articulate, a bone-level understanding that the point of being dangerous was having the option to put that danger between an innocent and whatever was coming. Without that option, the danger was just noise. He went back inside. Raker was in the room when he returned, standing near the window with his arms crossed, his presence making the room feel smaller without being threatening. Maisie had been moved to the far bed and was sleeping under both blankets. Elena was at the desk with the pages of Danny's letter spread in front of her, reading. She looked up when Gideon came in. "There's more," she said. "I know. I read it. Not all of it." She turned to the last 2 pages. "The last section. He wrote this the night before—" She stopped, steadied herself. "He wrote it the night before he drove Route 12. Gideon crossed to the desk. Danny's handwriting changed on the last 2 pages. Still controlled, but denser, the letters pressed harder into the paper, the way handwriting looked when the hand behind it was running on adrenaline and will. "I've been trying to find where the money goes after it clears Meridian. I think I know, but I can't prove it from the documents I have. What I can tell you is that somebody in the county sheriff's department has been running interference on any complaints related to the Harrow property. 3 different people have told me they filed reports and got nothing back, not even a case number. One of them told me the deputy who took her complaint called her back 3 days later and told her she was mistaken about what she'd seen. She hadn't filed anything that warranted that call, which means someone is accessing the complaint system and then making personal contact with complainants. That's not a deputy going rogue. That's a system. The bridge is the key. Whatever they're building on that property, the bridge has to come down eventually so they can control the access point completely. I don't know when. But if anyone ever tries to take a large group across Calhoun Crossing, especially at night, stop them. Tell Maisie. She'll remember. If I make it back from Route 12 tomorrow, I'm going to the FBI field office in Portland with what I have. If I don't—" The sentence ended there. He'd crossed it out. Whatever came after it, he'd decided not to put in writing. Gideon set the pages down. "The sheriff's department," he said. "Yes," Elena said. "You reported Danny's death to them." "Yes." "And Route 12 is in their jurisdiction." "Yes." Her voice was very flat. "The deputy who took my statement about the laptop and the wiped phone. I called him twice after to follow up. He stopped returning calls after the 2nd week. And then last month I got a letter from the department saying the investigation into the vehicle accident was closed. Accidental death. Single vehicle. No further inquiry warranted." Gideon stood very still. "Which means we can't call local law enforcement tonight," he said. "No," she said. "We can't." He looked at Raker. Raker's expression hadn't changed, which was its own kind of comment. "Priest," Gideon said. Raker pulled out his phone, typed, "Sent." 30 seconds later, a response came back. "Second vehicle confirmed on the service road," Raker said. "Black SUV, no plates. Priest says there's a 3rd person on foot. He picked up movement near the marina about 15 minutes ago, thinks it's a forward scout." Gideon did the math. 2 vehicles, minimum 4 people, plus a scout on foot. Well coordinated. Positioned before the Iron Saints had arrived, which meant they'd known about the Harbor Inn specifically, which meant either they'd been tracking Elena and Maisie before tonight, or— His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He picked up. The same voice as before. Same controlled precision. "You're reading the documents," the voice said. "I'd like them back." Gideon said nothing. "This doesn't have to expand any further," President Rohr. "The woman and the child can go wherever they choose. Our interest is strictly in the materials her husband compiled, which belong to a private legal matter and were obtained through a man you killed on Route 12, Gideon said. A pause. Brief, but there. "Accidents happen on rural roads in poor weather," the voice said. "Yeah," Gideon said. "So do consequences." He ended the call. Raker was looking at him. "They're going to move tonight," Gideon said. "They can't let us sit here with those documents until morning. And they know they can't move through the parking lot without going through us, which means service road," Raker said. "Service road." Gideon started toward the door and then stopped. Something was wrong. He wasn't sure what. Not a sound, not a movement, just a shift in the room's atmosphere. The specific change in pressure that 11 years of operating in places where things went sideways had trained him to feel before he understood it. He turned around slowly. Maisie was awake. She was sitting up in the bed, both blankets around her, watching him with those gray eyes that had gone from heavy to alert in the way children's eyes could, instantly and completely, as if sleep was just a room they stepped out of rather than a place they climbed back from. "They're going to come through the back," she said. Her voice was entirely calm. Elena made a sharp sound. "Maisie." "Daddy told me," the girl said. She was looking at Gideon, not her mother. "He said if they ever came, they'd go around the side where the dumpsters are, because that's the blind spot for the cameras." The room was silent. "He told you where the camera's blind spots were," Gideon said. "He showed me," she said. "When we checked in here the first time, last month. He walked me around the whole building." She pulled the blankets tighter. "He said we might have to stay here someday, and I should know it." Danny Roar Hollow had walked his 6-year-old daughter around a Harbor Inn parking lot and taught her the camera blind spots. Because he'd known. He'd known they'd end up here, and he'd known he might not be with them when they did, and he had done the only thing he could do, which was put his knowledge into the person he could still protect. Gideon looked at the child for a long moment, and something in his chest that had been hard and sealed for a very long time shifted, the way permafrost shifted, not breaking, just moving, making room for something it had been holding down. "Raker," he said, "get Priest and 2 others to the dumpster area right now, and tell Cortez to bring the formation up on the service roadside." Raker was already on his phone as he moved for the door. Gideon looked back at Elena. "Pack what matters. Documents first. Then whatever Maisie needs. You have 3 minutes." Elena nodded and moved. Not panicked, competent. The efficiency of a woman who had been in motion for 4 months and had gotten very good at reducing everything to what was essential. Gideon looked at Maisie. "You're going to stay with your mom," he said, "right next to her, no matter what you hear." Maisie considered this with the serious attention she brought to everything. "Okay," she said. Then, "Are you scared?" The question caught him entirely off guard. He thought about lying. He thought about the various reassuring things an adult said to a child in a dangerous situation, the platitudes that were meant to insulate rather than inform. "A little," he said. She nodded, as if this was the right answer. "Daddy said the brave ones are always a little scared," she said. "He said the ones who aren't scared are the ones you have to worry about." He stood there with that for a moment, then he moved. The next 8 minutes were the organized chaos of men who had done this before. Not this exactly, but the category of this, the rapid repositioning under pressure, the communication in short bursts and hand signals, the compression of time that happened when a situation required everything to happen simultaneously. Cortez brought 6 bikes around to the service road side. Priest and 2 others took up position near the dumpster enclosure, invisible in the shadow of the building's northeast corner. The Silverado on the road hadn't moved. Gideon put himself in the covered walkway outside room 6, his back to the wall, the storm coming sideways off the lot, the temperature somewhere around 19 degrees and dropping. He could see the east end of the building from here. He could see the service road. He could see the narrow alley between the building and the fence where the dumpsters were, and where, in the dark, Maisie had said the camera's blind spot was. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had never liked it, but he was good at it. The particular discipline of keeping the body still and the mind narrowed to the present, not the future, not the calculus of what might happen, just the immediate geometry of sight lines and sound, and the feel of his own breathing. 4 minutes. Then Priest's voice in his earpiece, very low. Movement, east side. 2 individuals, tactical gear, moving along the fence toward the dumpsters. Gideon didn't move. "Second pair," Priest said. "Service road, coming on foot, leaving the SUV, moving toward the rear door. 4 people total, organized, simultaneous approach. They were going to try to hit the room from 2 sides at once, fast and quiet. the kind of operation that worked on a single woman with a child and no protection. They did not know what was in the parking lot. "Hold," Gideon said into the earpiece. "Hold until I move." He waited 3 more seconds. Then he stepped out from the walkway and walked directly toward the northeast corner of the building, in the open, his boots loud on the frozen concrete, unhurried, and he turned the corner and came face to face with the 2 men who were crouched in the shadow of the dumpster enclosure in full tactical black with their weapons trained at the ground. They had half a second of shock. In that half second, Priest and his 2 men materialized out of the darkness on either side of them, and from the service road came the sound of 6 Harley engines turning over simultaneously. Not moving, just turning over, the specific harmonic of displacement engines at idle that in the dark and the snow and the sudden chaos of noise and presence was exactly what it was designed to be: overwhelming. The 2 men in the dumpster shadow went still. Gideon stopped 6 feet from them. He was not wearing a weapon. He didn't need one. He had something more effective, which was the absolute certainty that he was not going to move, was not going to flinch, and was not going to offer them any version of this situation in which what they had planned was still possible. "You have about 4 seconds," he said, "to make a choice you can live with." The nearer of the 2 men, younger, maybe 30, the particular flat effect of someone with tactical training, looked past Gideon to where Priest and the others were standing, and then looked at the service road where the engines were still running, and then looked at Gideon. "Who are you people?" he said. "The ones who stopped," Gideon said. A long moment. Then the man's hands came up slowly, away from his sides. His partner followed. From the service road, Cortez's voice, "2 more secured back here. They're not fighting." Gideon exhaled slowly. That was when his earpiece crackled, and Priest's voice came through with something in it that made Gideon's attention snap like a wire pulled taut. "Gid," Priest said, "you need to come inside, right now." Something was wrong with his voice. Not danger wrong, something else. "What is it?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be the kind of pause a person took before saying something they wished they didn't have to say. "It's Boone," Priest said. "He's here. He came in through the front entrance 20 minutes ago while we were watching the back. He's been in the room with Elena and the girl." Another pause. "And he's on the phone. I caught him through the window. He doesn't know I can see him." Priest's voice dropped. He's talking to them, the other side. He's been giving them the layout." The cold came in off the ocean, and the engines idled on the service road, and somewhere inside room 6, Boone, 12-year member of the Iron Saints, man who had ridden at Gideon's left hand for a decade, man who had carried a brother's coffin twice and wept without shame both times, was on the phone with the people who had put a bomb under a bridge and tried to kill every single person in their formation. Gideon stood in the cold with this information and felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. Boone. He thought about the man's face at the formation's start tonight, the particular quietness that he'd attributed to the solemnity of the memorial ride, the way he'd hung back slightly in the parking lot when they'd rerouted, the moment near the motel entrance when he'd said he needed to use the bathroom, and Gideon had pointed him to the lobby without a second thought. Not a second thought. 12 years. He put one foot in front of the other and walked back toward room 6, and the storm came in off the Atlantic and the engines turned over in the dark, and the cold was so complete and so total that it had stopped feeling like temperature and started feeling like the specific weight of a thing that had already happened and could not be undone. And he put his hand on the door of room 6 and stood there for a moment with his palm flat against the cold paint, breathing. Then he pushed it open. Boone was standing near the window with his phone at his side, and when the door opened he turned and his face did the thing faces did when they had been carrying something for too long and the weight of it finally had somewhere to go. Not relief, not quite, but the particular collapse of a man who has been holding himself together through will alone and has just run out of will. Gideon looked at him. Boone looked back. And in the silence between them, 12 years of brotherhood sat very still, like something alive that had just been told it was going to die and was waiting to find out if that was true. "Tell me," Gideon said. Boone's mouth opened, and what came out of it was the name of his daughter. Boone's daughter's name was Kara. She was 19 years old, and she was studying nursing at a community college in Tucson, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. and she had been taken from a parking lot outside her dormitory 11 days ago by two men in a gray SUV who had left a single photograph on her pillow. Her, zip-tied in a chair, a newspaper with the date visible, alive and unharmed, but surrounded by the specific message of people who understood how to communicate without saying anything that could be used in court. Boone told this to Gideon in the flat, drained monotone of a man who had been holding it alone for 11 days and had run completely out of the interior space required to hold something that size. He stood near the window of room 6 with his phone in his hand and his cut hanging off his shoulders like something he'd forgotten he was wearing. And he didn't look at Gideon while he talked. He looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. He looked at Maisie once, briefly, and then away, the way a man looked at the thing that most precisely illustrated the cost of what he'd done. Elena had taken Maisie into the bathroom and closed the door without being asked. The sound of the water running came through the thin wall. She'd turned on the tap, Gideon understood, so the child wouldn't hear. That kind of practiced protection, that specific reflex. It told him everything about how long Elena had been managing the space between what was real and what a 6-year-old needed to be insulated from. Gideon stood across the room from Boone and listened. 11 days ago, 2 days before the memorial ride route was finalized, Boone had received the photograph. 6 hours later, he'd received a phone call. Same controlled voice Gideon had heard twice tonight, outlining what was required. The route. The timing. Confirmation that the formation would cross Calhoun Crossing in full. Nothing else. Just those things, and in exchange, Kara would be returned unharmed after the ride. They wanted to know if you'd changed the route, Boone said. If there was any chance you'd reroute for weather. And you told them no, Gideon said. I told them you hadn't changed the memorial route in 11 years. A pause. Which is true. So you helped them build a bomb to kill 180 people. Boone flinched like he'd been hit. I didn't know about the bomb. I swear to you on every... He stopped himself. I knew something was going to happen at the bridge. I didn't know what. They told me it would scare you off, make you reroute. I told myself it was a warning, a scare tactic. His voice had gone very quiet. I told myself that because I needed to tell myself something. You told yourself that for 11 days, Gideon said. Boone said nothing. While you packed your gear for the memorial ride, Gideon said, while you rode next to me for 3 hours, while Maisie Hollow was standing in the snow in bare feet trying to keep us from getting blown off a bridge. Boone's jaw tightened. His eyes were wet, but he was not going to cry. Gideon could see that, the particular suppression of a man who had decided he didn't deserve the relief of it. Where's Kara now? Gideon said. I don't know. They call me. I don't call them. What did you tell them tonight? When you were on the phone just now? A long pause. I told them the formation was still here, that you'd taken 2 of their people. He looked up finally, and his eyes were the eyes of a man standing at the bottom of something very deep. I told them you were reading the documents. Gideon absorbed this. So they know what we have. Yes. And they know we're not leaving. Yes. The room was very quiet except for the water running through the wall and the storm working at the window, and somewhere out in the parking lot the low idle of engines that Cortez had kept running, which Gideon was grateful for now, in a way that had nothing to do with warmth. He looked at Boone for a long time. 12 years was a long time. Long enough that he knew the specific sound of this man's laugh, the way he held his coffee cup in both hands when it was cold, the name of his ex-wife, and the reason the marriage had ended, the scar on his left knee from a bike accident in 2016, the fact that he kept a photograph of Kara in his left breast pocket and touched it, unconsciously, when something frightened him. He was touching it now. Step outside, Gideon said. Boone looked up. I need you outside the room, Gideon said. Stay where priests can see you. Don't make a call. Don't send a message. Don't do anything. Can you do that? The question was precise and deliberate. Can you do that? Not will you? Because what Gideon needed to know was not Boone's intention, but his capacity, and the distinction mattered. Boone nodded. He moved to the door, slow, the walk of a man carrying full gravity. He stopped with his hand on the frame. I'm sorry, Gid, he said. Gideon said nothing. Boone went outside. Gideon stood in the empty room for a moment, alone, and let himself feel what he needed to feel about Boone for exactly 10 seconds. The specific cold fury of a betrayal by someone you had trusted with your back, The grief of it, the recalculation it required. And then he put it in the same place he put everything else that couldn't be addressed in the field, the sealed interior room where things waited until there was time for them. And he went to the bathroom door and knocked twice. Elena opened it. Maisie was sitting on the edge of the tub with a towel around her shoulders, fully awake, watching him with those eyes. "We need to move," he said to Elena. "Not outside. Somewhere in this building that's not this room." Elena nodded. "The maintenance office. End of the ground floor, past the laundry. Danny showed me. It has a secondary lock and no exterior window." Of course, Danny had shown her. "Raker," Gideon said into his earpiece. "Here. Maintenance office, ground floor east. Can you clear it? 2 minutes. You have one." He looked at Maisie. "You know how to be very quiet and very fast?" She stood up from the tub. "Yes," she said, as if this were a skill she had practiced. He believed her entirely. Raker cleared the maintenance office in 50 seconds. It was a narrow room, industrial shelving, a pegboard of keys, a folding table, a single overhead fluorescent that buzzed at a frequency just above the threshold of irritation. The lock was a keyed deadbolt and a secondary bar latch, exactly what Elena had said. No exterior windows, one vent in the ceiling that was too small for a person. Gideon moved them through the ground floor corridor without using the exterior walkway, staying inside, Raker ahead, and Priest at the rear. Maisie walked between Gideon and Elena with her hand in her mother's, and her eyes moving in the way children's eyes moved when they were paying close attention to everything and processing it in some interior language adults had mostly forgotten. They got the door locked behind them. Gideon set Priest inside with Elena and Maisie and went back out into the corridor to find Cortez. Cortez met him at the east end of the building, face raw from the cold, snow in the creases of his jacket. "Talk to me," Gideon said. "The 2 we secured from outside are zip-tied in the laundry room. Holt's watching them. The service road guys, same. Brenner's got them in the storage shed at the back." Cortez paused. "One of the service road guys has been trying to talk. Says he's private security, says he was told this was a recovery operation for stolen corporate documents, says he didn't sign up for... Bring him to me." "Gid," Cortez lowered his voice. "I heard about Boone." "Yeah. What are we doing with him?" "Nothing yet." "Where is he?" "Sitting on the curb near your bike. Priest got eyes on him." Gideon nodded. "Leave him there." The private security contractor was a man in his late 30s named Voss. He gave the name without being asked, which suggested he'd made a calculation about his situation and decided cooperation was the outcome with the best odds. He was sitting on a folding chair in the laundry room with his wrists zip-tied in front of him, and the particular expression of a man who had been told he was walking into a simple retrieval job and had arrived somewhere considerably more complicated. Gideon came in and sat on the edge of the washing machine across from him and didn't say anything for a moment. The silence worked. "I want to be clear about what I was hired for," Voss said. "So be clear," Gideon said. "Document recovery. Private civil matter. We were told the woman had materials belonging to a client that had been taken without authorization by her late husband, who was a former contractor. We were told there was no risk of law enforcement involvement because the local department had been..." He stopped. "Had been what?" Gideon said. Voss pressed his mouth together. "Had been managed," he said carefully. There it was. Not implied, not inferred, stated, in the specific euphemism of a man who worked in an industry where managed was a word that meant a specific thing. "Who hired your company?" Gideon said. "I don't get that level of information. We work through a dispatch service. Clients are anonymous to field operatives." "Who dispatched tonight's job?" "A coordinator named Wells, based in Portland. That's all I have." "Wells work for Meridian Infrastructure Partners?" Voss blinked. The blink told Gideon more than anything the man could have said. "I don't know that name," Voss said. "You just told me you did," Gideon said. Voss looked at his hands. "The man on the phone," Gideon said. "The one who called me twice tonight. Who is he?" "I don't know." "Guess." "Above my operational level. I genuinely..." He stopped again. Recalibrated. The coordinator mentioned a name once, in a context that suggested he was the client-side point of contact. Not a name I recognized. "What name?" Voss was quiet for a moment. "Carver," he said. "That's all I heard. Carver." Gideon filed it. How many more people do you have in the field tonight? Voss's jaw moved. There's a shooter, he said. I didn't know about him until we were in position. He's not part of our team. Our coordinator told us 20 minutes ago that a specialized asset had been added to the operation. I don't know his position. I don't know his target parameters. He paused. That's when I decided the risk profile of this job had exceeded what I was paid for. A sniper. Independent asset added late, which meant Carver or whoever was coordinating had decided that whatever they had in the field tonight might not be sufficient and had called in a harder solution. An independent sniper meant no organizational connection, no chain of custody, complete deniability. It also meant someone out there in the storm, in the dark, with a long rifle and a target list that Gideon could not fully define, was currently finding a position. He left Voss in the laundry room and went back into the corridor and stopped. He needed to think. He put his back against the wall and crossed his arms and looked at the floor and thought. The immediate geometry. Elena and Maisie were in the maintenance office with Priest. The building gave them cover from small arms, but not from a trained sniper with a high-powered rifle, if the sniper found a position with an angle to the roof. The parking lot was exposed. The service road was exposed. The storm reduced visibility, but a thermal scope made weather largely irrelevant, and anyone running this kind of operation at this level would have thermal capacity. The secondary geometry. Geometry Boone had told them the documents were being read. Carver, whoever he was, now knew that the Iron Saints had 11 pages of Danny Hollow's documentation, which meant the calculation had shifted from retrieval to elimination. You didn't send a sniper to a retrieval job. You sent a sniper to a job where the objective was no longer recovery, but silence. The tertiary geometry, the one that had been building in the back of his mind since he'd read the last page of Danny's notes. The sheriff's department was compromised, which meant local law enforcement was not an option. The closest FBI field office was Portland, 3 hours in good weather, which was not what tonight was offering. Priest had the radio intercepts, but not a decode, which meant they had evidence of coordination, but not of specific criminal acts, in a form that would compel federal response tonight, in this storm. They were effectively alone. 176 bikers in a parking lot. Boone subtracted, 4 contractors secured, and a sniper in the dark, and a man named Carver on a phone somewhere, recalculating, and a 6-year-old girl in a maintenance office who had already done more to protect other people than most adults managed in a lifetime. His phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from an unknown number, which was unusual. The people who'd been contacting him tonight preferred voice, the untraceable kind. He looked at the screen. A photograph. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. A building interior, gray concrete walls, industrial lighting, a metal chair, a young woman in the chair. Dark hair, her father's stubbornness in the set of her jaw even through the obvious fear. Alive. A timestamp in the corner, 47 minutes ago, Kara Boone. Below the photograph, a single line of text. The girl for the documents and the woman, you have until 4 a.m. He looked at the timestamp on his phone. It was 1:47 a.m., 2 hours and 13 minutes. He walked back to the front of the building, out into the cold of the parking lot, and found Boone exactly where Cortez had said, sitting on the curb near the Road King, his cut collar turned up against the snow, his hands between his knees, looking at the pavement with the focused attention of a man examining the specific geography of his own failure. Gideon crouched down in front of him and held up the phone. Boone looked at the photograph. His face did something complicated and painful and entirely private, and then it went still. She's alive, Gideon said. 47 minutes ago. Boone nodded once, very small. They want the documents and Elena in exchange for her. 4 a.m. Boone said nothing. He was still looking at the photograph. I'm going to get her back, Gideon said. Boone looked up. His eyes were red at the edges. I'm going to get her back, Gideon said again. And I need you to understand that I'm saying that not because I've forgiven what you did tonight, but because she is not the one who did it, and she doesn't get to carry the weight of your choices, and I am not in the business of leaving a 19-year-old girl in a chair because her father made a desperate decision under impossible pressure. He held Boone's gaze. But after she's safe, you and I are going to have a different conversation. Do you understand that? Boone's jaw worked. Yes, he said. Can you function? A pause. Yes. Then get up. Boone stood. Gideon straightened and looked at him for a moment. This man he had ridden with for 12 years. This man whose particular combination of loyalty and love and terror had nearly gotten all of them killed. And what he felt was not clean enough to be called anything simple, so he didn't try to name it. I need everything you know about how they've been communicating with you, he said. Phone numbers, timing, anything they've said about their location. Everything. Boone started talking. It took 11 minutes. Gideon listened with the careful attention of a man building a map from fragments, noting each piece. The calls had come from rotating numbers, but always within a specific area code, Portland Coastal. The coordinator had referenced a location called the Meridian Facility once, early on, and then corrected himself, as if the name had slipped out. The photograph of Kara had metadata. Boone hadn't noticed, but Gideon pulled up the image properties on the forwarded file, and there it was, not scrubbed, a geotag that put the origin of the photograph approximately 4 miles northeast of their current position, which in this geography meant the Harbor Commercial District, specifically the area near the old cannery buildings that had been sold off and partially redeveloped in the last 3 years. Harrow Coastal Holdings. The facility was on the Harrow property. Of course it was. He was back inside with Cortez within 2 minutes, laying it out. The sniper, the deadline, the location, the 4-mile distance. Cortez listened with his arms crossed and his face in the configuration it took when he was doing tactical assessment, which was the same configuration it took when he was angry, which was convenient. The sniper's the problem, Cortez said. Yes. We move on the facility, he has everyone in this parking lot exposed. Yes. So we need to find him first. Or draw him out, Gideon said. Cortez looked at him. I need Raker and 4 volunteers, Gideon said. People who understand the risk. Not an order. A request. I'll put the word out. Cortez paused. And the facility? Small team. 6. Fast and quiet. He paused. I'll lead. Cortez opened his mouth. Don't, Gideon said. Cortez closed it. In the maintenance office, Priest had his laptop open and was working through the radio intercepts with the focused intensity of a man who had spent years extracting signal from noise and had lost patience with both. He'd triangulated the encrypted transmissions to a position consistent with the Harbor District, which confirmed the geotag, and he'd identified a secondary transmission pattern, shorter, irregular, inconsistent with the coordinated team frequency, that he believed was the sniper communicating independently with the coordinator. He's mobile, Priest said without looking up. Moving positions every 20 minutes or so. Disciplined. He's not going to stay on one rooftop long enough to get fixed. What's his current position? Best estimate, Marina Access Road. Elevated. Harbor Authority building has a 4-story observation deck that'd give him line of sight across the parking lot and most of the building's south face. Maisie was sitting on the floor next to Elena with a piece of paper and a crayon that she'd apparently had in the pocket of her nightgown, which was the kind of detail that Gideon noted and filed without comment. She was drawing with the focused economy of a child who used drawing the way some people use silence, not to produce something, but to process. He glanced at what she was drawing without meaning to. It was the building. Their building. Seen from outside, from above, the Harbor Inn's L-shaped footprint rendered in the specific approximation of a 6-year-old's spatial memory. And it was accurate. The proportions were off in the way, children's proportions were always off. But the layout was right. The relationship between the service road and the parking lot and the maintenance end of the building was right. And in the upper right corner, she'd drawn a small figure on top of another building with something in its hands that was not ambiguous in its shape. She'd drawn the sniper. Not from information, from the window. She'd seen him from the bathroom window when the water was running, before they'd moved, and she'd registered it and said nothing because she'd learned, somewhere in the specific school of her particular childhood, not to say things until she knew who was ready to hear them. Gideon crouched beside her. When did you see him? He said quietly. She didn't look up from the drawing. When we were in the bathroom. There's a gap in the frosted glass at the top. I stood on the toilet. She continued drawing. He was on the building with the blue roof, the one with the fish sign. The Harbor Master's building. Not the Harbor Authority building Priest had estimated. The Harbor Master's office, which was adjacent, slightly lower, but with a different angle. A better angle. Priest, Gideon said. Priest looked up. Gideon held up the drawing. Priest looked at it for a moment, then at the child, then back at the drawing, and his expression did the thing expressions did when a person encountered information that required them to revise their model of the world. "Harbor Master," Priest said. "Yeah." Priest turned back to his laptop and started working. Elena was watching Maisie with an expression that Gideon couldn't name exactly. Not surprised, because Elena had stopped being surprised by her daughter, but something layered, something that held both grief and a fierce, complicated pride, and underneath both of those something that looked like fear of a very specific kind. The fear of a parent who understood that the qualities that made their child extraordinary were the same qualities that put them in rooms like this one. "She's been doing this since he died," Elena said quietly, not quite to Gideon, not quite to herself. "Noticing things, remembering things, things she shouldn't." She stopped. "Danny used to say she had his eyes. He meant it literally, but it was—" She stopped again. "He meant she saw things the way he saw them, as problems to be understood and solved." "She's going to be okay," Gideon said. Elena looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but I know I'm going to do everything in my capacity to make it true." She held his eyes for a moment. Something in her face settled, not quite peace, but the particular resolution of a person who has decided to trust the evidence in front of them rather than the fear behind them. Cortez appeared in the doorway. He looked at Gideon. "Raker's ready, teams assembled." A pause. "And we have a problem." The problem was outside, in the parking lot, where the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees and the storm had taken on the specific sustained quality that suggested it was done being transitional and had committed to duration. The problem was not the storm. Holt was standing near the East Lot entrance with 6 men from the Yuma chapter, and the configuration of their posture communicated something that Gideon read before he reached them. "We want to go in on the facility," Holt said. "That's not the plan," Gideon said. "The plan has a sniper problem," Holt said, "and it has a 4 a.m. problem, and it has a Boone problem that I'm not going to pretend isn't also a Brotherhood problem." He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. 6 guys in and out isn't sufficient for an unknown facility with an unknown number of occupants and a girl we need to bring out intact. "I know the math, Holt. Then adjust the plan." They looked at each other. The snow came between them sideways, the kind that found every gap in your collar. "I'm going to the facility with 6 men," Gideon said. "Raker leads the sniper draw. Cortez holds the building with the rest of the formation. That's the plan. And if the facility's hardened, then we adapt. With 6 men. With 6 men and the evidence package we already have, which goes to the FBI field office in Portland the moment we have enough cell signal to transmit it. We don't need to win a firefight. We need to get Boone out and hold our position until federal jurisdiction overrides local law enforcement." He paused. "We don't operate as an army. We operate as exactly what we are." Holt was quiet for a moment. "And what's that?" he said. "People who stopped when nobody else would," Gideon said. The parking lot was quiet except for the storm. Holt stepped back. The 6 Yuma men held their positions, not surrendering the disagreement, but acknowledging the decision, which among men like these was the same thing. Gideon turned toward the bikes. Then Priest's voice in his ear and the particular tight quality in it that preceded bad information delivered fast. "Get the secondary transmission, the sniper's frequency. It just went active. Burst pattern, which means he's not coordinating. He's communicating a target acquisition." A pause that was exactly 1 second long. "The pattern is for an imminent shot. He's got a target locked. Position? Harbor Master building, northeast face, same as the girl's drawing. Target? I can't—" Priest's voice shifted. "Wait. There's a figure in the parking lot, east side near the bikes." Another pause. "Gid, it's Boone. He's standing in the open." Gideon was already moving. He crossed the parking lot at a run, the frozen surface treacherous under his boots, the snow coming hard now from the northeast, from the direction of the Harbor Master building. And he was covering ground fast, but the distance was 40 yards, and Boone was standing near the Road King with his face turned toward the building with the fish sign, as if he'd heard something, or felt something, the specific instinct of a man whose body remembered what danger felt like even after his mind had stopped calculating it. 20 yards. Boone turned. He saw Gideon running. His expression changed, not to fear, but to something more complicated, the expression of a man who has spent 11 days trying to decide whether he deserved to be saved, and had his answer arrived at in the form of someone running across a frozen parking lot toward him. 10 yards. Gideon hit him at a dead run, both arms, driving them both sideways behind the mass of the Road King just as the sound reached them. Not a crack, not the movie version of a gunshot, but the specific compressed thump of a suppressed high-caliber round hitting pavement exactly where Boone had been standing, the chips of concrete spraying cold against Gideon's face as they went down together behind the bike. They lay on the frozen pavement, breathing. The storm continued. After a moment, Boone said very quietly, "You came back for me." "Don't make it mean more than it does," Gideon said. But they were both alive, and the pavement was cold against his cheek, and the shot that had meant to kill Boone had missed by the exact distance of Gideon's sprint, which was not a margin either of them was going to be comfortable examining too closely in the minutes ahead. Gideon got to his knees behind his bike and looked toward the harbor master building. He couldn't see anything, the storm, the dark, the distance. But he knew the man was up there, recalibrating, possibly repositioning, and the window between this shot and the next was closing in ways that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with a sniper who had now confirmed that his targets were mobile and protected and had just demonstrated that the parking lot was no longer a safe perimeter. "Get inside," he said to Boone. Boone moved. Gideon stayed behind the Road King and put his earpiece in and keyed it. "Raker," he said. "Heard it," Raker said. "We're moving." "He's repositioning. You have maybe 4 minutes before he finds a new angle." "Understood." "Raker." Gideon paused. "Be careful." A brief silence. Then, in the dry tone Raker reserved for things that did not warrant comfort, "Always am." Gideon stayed behind the bike, and the storm pressed down, and the parking lot was very still in the way that outdoor spaces went still after a shot. The particular charged silence of a space that had just been reminded of its own exposure. And somewhere 4 miles northeast, in a building on Harrow Coastal Holdings property, a 19-year-old girl named Kara was sitting in a metal chair counting the hours. And somewhere above him in the dark, a man with a suppressed rifle was finding his next position. And somewhere in a maintenance office, a 6-year-old with gray eyes was drawing things she shouldn't have been able to see. And the documents that Danny Hollow had died to protect were in Elena's bag. And the bag was in the maintenance office. And every single person in this situation was now orbiting those 11 pages of yellow legal paper like they were the gravitational center of everything that was about to happen. He pulled out his phone and looked at the photograph of Kara one more time. Then he called Cortez. "Get me the vehicle," he said. "We're not waiting for 4 a.m. "The sniper, Raker's handling the sniper. Get me the vehicle and give me 5 men who can move fast and quiet and understand that the objective is the girl and the evidence and nothing else." He paused. "And call Priest. Tell him to start transmitting the documents to the FBI field office now, whatever signal we have. Partial transmission is better than none. And if the signal's not enough, then we make sure someone gets out of here with the physical copies," Gideon said, "which means we cannot all be in one location when this resolves." He thought about Maisie's drawing, the building from above, the sniper on the roof with something in his hands. He thought about a man named Danny Roar Hollow who had walked his daughter around a parking lot and taught her where the cameras couldn't see. He thought about what it meant to prepare someone else to finish the mission you might not survive, and what that kind of preparation cost, and what it said about the man who had done it, and whether the person receiving that preparation understood what they'd been given. He thought Maisie understood. He thought she'd understood since the moment she stepped into the headlights. He pulled himself up from behind the Road King into the cold and the dark, and the snow came off the Atlantic hard enough to sting, and somewhere in the harbor district a man named Carver was looking at a clock and making calculations. And Gideon Roar was done letting other people define the geometry of this night. He walked toward the vehicle Cortez was bringing around, and the 5 men fell in beside him, and the parking lot fell away behind them, and the road ahead was dark, and the storm was not letting up, and what waited at the end of it was going to require him to be something he had spent the last several years trying to put distance between himself and not a soldier, not an outlaw, something older than either. The kind of man who understood that the only difference between a protector and a predator was the direction you pointed the damage, and had made his peace with pointing it in exactly one direction for the rest of whatever time he had left. His phone buzzed one final time. Unknown number. He answered without breaking stride. "You missed," he said. The controlled voice on the other end was silent for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to communicate that the miss had not been anticipated, and that the recalculation happening on the other end of the line was not small. "You're making a very significant mistake," Carver said. "I've made bigger ones," Gideon said. "The difference is, I'm still here to talk about them." He ended the call and put the phone in his pocket and got into the vehicle, and the door closed, and the harbor road opened up ahead of them in the headlights, gray and wet and disappearing into the dark. And 4 miles away, a girl was waiting, and a conspiracy was sitting on 11 pages of yellow legal paper, and the night was not done with any of them yet, not by a long distance. And what Gideon did not know, could not have known, was that when they reached the facility and got through the door and found the room where Kara was being held, they were also going to find something else, something Danny Hollow had hidden there months ago in the specific faith of a man who believed that the truth, protected carefully enough, would eventually find the people capable of carrying it the rest of the way home. The facility was not what Gideon had expected, which meant Danny Hollow had been further along than his notes suggested. 4 miles of harbor road in a stolen contractor van. Cortez had found it parked behind the storage shed, keys in the ignition, which was either careless or a trap, and they'd agreed to proceed as if it were both. Raker had peeled off with 3 men toward the harbor master building 20 minutes ago. No radio contact since. Either the sniper problem was being handled or it wasn't, and either way Gideon had to move as if it was, because the alternative was waiting in a parking lot until Carver recalibrated and sent something worse. The 5 men with him, Cortez, Dowd, a former Army Ranger named Etch, who joined the Iron Saints 6 years ago and rarely spoke but moved through tight spaces with the specific economy of someone who'd done this professionally, a man named Greer from the Portland chapter, who had civilian contractor experience and knew the harbor district's commercial properties, and Boone. He'd brought Boone. Not because he trusted him, not yet, not fully, maybe not ever again in the way he had before, which was a grief he'd scheduled for later, but because Boone knew Kara's face. Boone's presence would communicate something to Kara in the moment they reached her that no stranger's face could communicate. And because the particular fury Boone was currently operating on was the kind that burned clean and directed, and Gideon had learned to recognize useful anger when he saw it. Greer took them off the harbor road 2 miles out and navigated by memory through a service corridor that ran behind the commercial district, unmarked, unpaved, past the first quarter mile, the kind of road that existed for industrial access and didn't appear on standard mapping. The van rode rough on the frozen ruts, the headlights cutting a narrow channel through the storm. Nobody spoke. The facility resolved out of the dark gradually, the way large structures did in poor visibility. First a mass, then a shape, then specific details. It had been a cannery once, Greer had said, converted in the partial redevelopment. The conversion was recent and deliberate and expensive. The exterior retained enough industrial camouflage to avoid attention from the road, but the windows that should have been dark were covered from the inside, and the loading dock that should have been inactive had fresh tire tracks in the snow that hadn't yet filled, which meant traffic in the last hour. Greer stopped the van 300 yards out and killed the lights. They sat in the dark. "Loading dock's the entry point they'll expect," Gideon said, "east face." "There's a secondary access on the north side," Greer said. "Original cannery maintenance entrance. It won't be on any plans they pulled for the conversion because it predates the county filing system. It's in the structure itself, behind the cold storage units that are still in place." "You're sure it's still there?" "I helped survey this building for a client 6 years ago," Greer said. "I'm sure." "How wide?" "Single person." Gideon looked at Cortez. "Single person first," Cortez said, which was not quite agreement but was the closest thing to it available given the circumstances. "Etch goes first," Gideon said. "I follow, then Boone. Dowd and Greer hold the van, cover the road. If anything on the radio, anything, you pull back to the parking lot and you don't wait for us." Dowd opened his mouth. "Non-negotiable," Gideon said. Dowd closed it. They moved through the snow in single file, using the remains of the cannery's old equipment yard for cover. Rusted hulks of processing machinery, a collapsed lean-to, a chain-link enclosure that had once held fuel tanks and now held 3 inches of ice. The temperature had dropped again. Gideon could feel his left hand beginning to lose precision in the cold. the shrapnel-scarred tissue contracting and stiffening in the way it did below 20 degrees. And he flexed it as he moved and told it to cooperate, and it complied to the degree it was capable of, which was approximately 60%. Enough. The north entrance was where Greer had said it would be, a metal door, original hardware, recessed into the foundation so that it sat below the current floor level, accessible by 3 concrete steps that had been partially obscured by an equipment pallet that someone had shoved against the wall without quite blocking the frame. The hasp had a padlock on it that was not original hardware. It was new, keyed, the kind used in temporary security installations. Etch looked at it for about 4 seconds, then produced a tension wrench and a pick from somewhere in his cut that Gideon had the good sense not to ask about, and the lock opened in 90 seconds, and the door swung inward on hinges that had last been maintained sometime before Gideon was born. Cold air came out, colder than the outside, the residual cold of spaces that held refrigeration for decades and never fully lost it. Dark. The smell of old fish and new concrete and something chemical that Gideon associated with construction sealant. Etch went in. Gideon followed. The interior was a corridor, low-ceilinged, the original cannery access passage that ran along the north foundation wall. Greer had said it connected to the main floor through a utility passage near the original cold storage units, which were still in place. Huge insulated panels, floor to ceiling, that would provide both concealment and a navigational landmark. They moved by feel and by the narrow beam of a penlight Etch produced, its red filter keeping their night vision intact, casting everything in the color of something not quite alive. 40 feet, 60. The passage turned right and the ceiling rose, and the cold storage panels materialized out of the dark on their left. 10 feet of insulated white panels, frost still on the original hardware, the industrial archaeology of a building that had processed 100,000 pounds of Atlantic cod before the industry moved south and left the buildings behind like shed skin. Beyond the cold storage, light. Not much. The edge of it, coming from ahead and to the right, the specific warm artificial light of an interior space occupied and active. Gideon put his hand on Etch's shoulder and they stopped. Voices. 2 distinct voices from what Gideon could hear. One closer, one further, the one further raised slightly, the tone of someone giving instruction. He couldn't make out words through the insulation and the distance. But the closer voice was responding in short intervals, which meant a conversation in progress, which meant the room ahead was not an alert posture. Not yet. He leaned to Etch's ear. Count? Etch held up 2 fingers, then raised a shoulder slightly. Minimum 2, possibly more in other areas of the building. Gideon pulled back and looked at Boone in the dark. Boone's face was invisible except for his eyes, which caught the edge of the red penlight and reflected it back in the way eyes did in the dark, animal and very awake. He made a hand signal, hold, follow my lead, and Boone nodded once, tight and immediate. They moved to the edge of the cold storage units. The main floor opened up beyond it, a large industrial space, the original cannery processing floor, maybe 80 feet by 60, the ceiling 15 feet overhead. The conversion had left the structural bones in place and built inside them, metal shelving units, electrical conduit runs, what looked like a server rack cluster against the far wall covered by a plastic tarp that had come partially loose, folded workstation desks, a portable generator, cable runs. And in the center of the space, under a single overhead work light, a metal chair. Kara. She was upright, zip-tied at the wrist to the chair arms, her head up, her eyes open. She was wearing the same clothes as in the photograph. Jeans, a sweatshirt with her college logo, one shoe, because the other had come off at some point, and nobody had bothered to retrieve it. She had a cut above her left eyebrow that had dried, and the set of her jaw was exactly what Boone had said. Her father's stubbornness, her father's refusal to give the situation more of her than it was entitled to. She was alive. She was looking at the near guard, a man in tactical black sitting on an overturned crate 12 feet from her, his weapon on his thigh, his attention on his phone, with the specific controlled contempt of a young woman who had decided that whatever happened next, she was not going to let these people have her fear. The second voice was coming from the far end of the space, behind a partition wall that had been added in the conversion, plywood and metal stud, a temporary office structure. A door, slightly open. Light through the gap, Carver. Gideon was certain of it the way he was certain of things that didn't announce themselves with evidence but arrived as the accumulation of 100 smaller signals resolved into a single point. He put his mouth against Etch's ear. The guard. Can you do it quiet? Etch looked at the geometry. The guard's position, the distance, the chair configuration, the sight lines from the partition office. He considered for about 3 seconds, then nodded. The moment he moves, Gideon said, we go for the girl. Boone, you get her loose. I go for the office. Boone's jaw was so tight, Gideon could see the muscle in it from here. Etch moved. He came out of the shadow of the cold storage units in a trajectory that kept him outside the guard's peripheral vision for as long as possible. Wide left, low, using the shelving units for intermittent cover, moving with the flat patience of someone who had learned that urgency and speed were not the same thing, and that confusing them was how operations failed. The guard looked up from his phone, not at Etch, at Kara. She had shifted in her chair, a small, deliberate movement, a scrape of the chair leg on the concrete that drew his eyes. She had seen Etch. She had understood what she was seeing in the same moment, and she had made a decision and acted on it in the span of a breath, the way her father had taught her to process and respond, the way this family apparently did things. The guard's eyes were on Kara when Etch reached him, and then they were not looking at anything in particular, and Etch held the man's weight carefully and lowered him to the concrete without a sound that carried. Gideon was already moving. He crossed the floor to Kara in 12 strides. Boone half a step behind him, and Kara looked up at them with those eyes. Her father's eyes, Boone's eyes, alive and assessing, and said nothing. Just extended her wrists in the most economical communication of trust he had ever witnessed. Boone had a folding knife open before he reached her. He cut the right zip tie first, then the left, and when her hands came free, she grabbed his wrist with both of hers and held on for exactly 2 seconds. Not a breakdown, not relief, just contact, just the confirmation that he was real. And then she let go and stood up. Can you move? Gideon said. Yes, she said in Boone's voice. There are more people in this building. We're going out the north passage. You stay between your father and Etch. She nodded. She didn't ask about her shoe. She would have walked across broken glass without asking about her shoe. Gideon looked at Boone. Get her out. Boone looked at him. What are you? I said get her out. From behind the partition office, the voice had stopped. The call, or conversation, or whatever was happening on the other side of that plywood wall had gone quiet in the way things went quiet when something changed in the ambient environment, when a sound registered at the edge of perception and hadn't been identified yet. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then the door opened. The man who came through it was not what Gideon had constructed in his mind from the voice on the phone. Not physically large, not visually threatening in the ways he'd anticipated. He was around 50, well-dressed for a man inside an industrial building in the middle of a coastal snowstorm. The kind of well-dressed that was habitual rather than intentional. The suit and tie of someone for whom those things were default rather than chosen. He had the face of a man who had spent decades in rooms where decisions were made and had absorbed the specific confidence of such rooms into his bearing so thoroughly that it now lived in his skeleton. He stopped when he saw Gideon. He looked at the guard on the floor, at the empty chair with the cut zip ties, at the north passage where Boone and Kara and Etch had already disappeared. Then he looked at Gideon, and what crossed his face was not panic. It was a rapid recalculation, the kind that experienced men made when a variable shifted, assessing whether the new geometry still offered a workable outcome. You're Carver, Gideon said. The man's posture did not change. You're President Rohr, he said. I've read about the Iron Saints. You've managed to avoid federal indictment for... I don't need the resume comparison, Gideon said. Where's your backup in this building? A slight pause. They'll be here shortly. No, they won't, Gideon said. You had 2 at the service road, 2 at the dumpsters, 2 in this building. We have all 4 from the inn and the one on the floor behind me. The one unaccounted for is your sniper, who my people are currently engaged with at the Harbor Master building. Carver's jaw moved slightly. Which means, right now, Gideon said, it's you and me and whatever's behind you in that office. Carver looked at him for a long moment. What do you want? He said. Not desperate, practical. The pragmatism of a man who was down to negotiation and knew it. I want to know who Meridian Infrastructure Partners reports to, Gideon said. I have the shell structure. I have the land deal. I have the bridge connection. I have the sheriff's department coordination. What I don't have is the top of it. That's not something I'm able to. I also want to know why the bridge, Gideon said, not the access theory. Danny's notes get me to access, but taking out 180 civilians with military-grade explosive on a federal highway is a level of risk that doesn't make sense for a land deal, even a corrupt one. So there's something on that property that changes the math. What is it? Carver's expression shifted, very slightly, the micro-expression of a man who had not expected the question to be that specific. You're better informed than I thought, he said. Danny Hollow was better informed than you thought, Gideon said. I'm just carrying it the rest of the way. From outside, through the facility's metal walls and the storm, Gideon heard something that made his chest tighten. Not an explosion, not a shot, but the specific collective sound of Harley engines, multiple, moving at speed on the harbor road. Not one or two, more than that. The formation. Cortez had moved the formation, which meant either the situation at the Harbor Inn had resolved or escalated. And either way, the cavalry was 4 minutes out, which changed the geometry of the conversation he was having with Carver in ways Carver was also processing. Carver heard it too. He looked toward the sound, then back at Gideon. The recalculation moved across his face again, and this time what it landed on was not negotiation. He stepped back toward the office door. Gideon moved. The distance between them was 20 feet, and Gideon crossed it in a way that was not elegant. He was 51 years old with a compromised left hand and 3 hours of cold in his muscles, but was sufficient because sufficient was the only category that mattered right now. He reached the door a half step behind Carver, got his hand on the frame before it closed, and pushed through. The office was small. A folding table with a laptop, 2 phones, a tactical radio, a filing cabinet, and on the table, next to the laptop, something that stopped Gideon for exactly 1 second in the doorway before his mind processed it. A stack of printed documents, technical schematics, engineering drawings of the kind that came from licensed structural engineers, the specific dense technical language of load calculations and material specifications and site surveys. And at the top of the stack, a site map, the Harrow property, all 42 acres. But the map was not a residential development plan. The footprint of what was proposed was not houses, not commercial buildings, not anything that required rezoning for private residential use. It was a containment facility. Below-grade construction. Reinforced concrete walls, 4 feet thick, specialized ventilation. A loading specification for the access road that would require a modified bridge. A bridge rebuilt to carry significantly higher axle loads than Calhoun Crossing's current structure. The land wasn't being developed. It was being converted into something that required the bridge to be gone and replaced with something purpose-built, and required the access road to be controlled completely, and required exactly the kind of below-grade reinforced construction that would explain a foundation specification designed for a building that would never appear above the tree line. Military contractors. Not building something for sale, building something that was meant to be invisible. Carver had gotten to the far side of the table. He had one of the phones in his hand. Put it down, Gideon said. There are people I need to contact who... I said put it down. Carver looked at him. The confidence was still there. Not gone, not broken, but reconfigured, operating now on a different frequency. The confidence of a man who believed that what he was part of was large enough to absorb tonight's losses and continue. You don't understand what you're looking at, Carver said. Enlighten me. This is a federal contract, Carver said. Classified infrastructure. The corruption you think you found is a cover layer. The land deal, the shell companies, the commissioner, all of it is a classification mechanism. The kind of thing that looks like a crime from the outside because it's designed to. He paused. Which means the moment your people transmit those documents to the FBI field office, you're not whistleblowing. You're interfering with a classified federal operation, and every person in your formation becomes a liability. The room was very quiet. Gideon looked at him. If it's a legitimate classified operation, Gideon said, then why did you put a bomb under a bridge to kill 180 civilians? Carver's mouth opened. Because Danny Hollow wasn't just documenting the land deal, Gideon said. He found something that actual federal oversight couldn't sanction, something on that property that didn't pass the classification test because it wasn't classified, it was hidden. There's a difference. And you know there's a difference, and that's why you killed him. And that's why a 6-year-old girl has been living in motels for 4 months. And that's why tonight happened the way it did. Carver was very still. What's in the containment facility? Gideon said. The phone in Carver's hand buzzed. He looked at it, and the expression that crossed his face in that moment, before he controlled it, before the professional composure reasserted itself, was the expression of a man receiving information that told him the geometry had shifted again, and not in his favor. He put the phone on the table slowly. Your people are very thorough, he said. Gideon waited. The FBI field office in Portland received a partial transmission 40 minutes ago, Carver said. Enough to open a preliminary inquiry, not enough to compel immediate action. He paused. But then your communications man apparently established a relay through a secondary signal source and completed the transmission 12 minutes ago. Full document package. Another pause. And a federal agent named Whitmore, who's been building a case on Meridian Infrastructure Partners for 16 months from the Virginia side, received a copy simultaneously. He's been waiting for exactly this kind of corroborating evidence from a civilian source. The name Whitmore landed in the room like something thrown. Gideon hadn't known the name, but the way Carver said it, the specific weight a man put on a name that had been a persistent problem, told him everything about its significance. So it's done, Gideon said. The legal process is initiated, Carver said carefully. That's not the same as done. No, Gideon said, but it's enough that you're not going to do anything else tonight. Carver looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly, he set both phones face down on the table. It was not surrender. It was the specific pragmatic withdrawal of a man who had been in enough rooms to know when the room had turned, and who understood that the next room was going to be a different kind of room entirely, federal, documented, the opposite of the darkness he'd been operating in. From outside, the engines were close now, very close. Gideon heard them the way he heard them in his chest, the harmonic of displacement engines running in formation, not panicked, not charging, just moving, the specific sound of a brotherhood that had decided to be somewhere and was now arriving there. He heard Cortez's pipes among them. He could distinguish Cortez's bike by sound the way you distinguished a voice you'd heard daily for 17 years. And he heard Holt's and Raker's and the particular layered frequency of the formation's full presence. 176 motorcycles. All of them. They had left 2 at the Harbor Inn with Elena and Maisie. Every other one was outside this building right now. Carver heard it too, and something in his face did the thing faces did when the actual scale of something resolved, when the reality of what he was looking at displaced the model he'd been operating with, which had apparently not included the possibility of a full biker formation arriving at a classified facility at 3 in the morning in a coastal snowstorm. There are federal statutes governing interference with, he started. There are also federal statutes governing the murder of civilians on federal highways, Gideon said, and the kidnapping of a 19-year-old college student, and the corruption of county law enforcement, and whatever you're building in that hole in the ground that you couldn't put through legitimate federal contracting channels because someone upstream decided it didn't pass the smell test. He paused. Pick your statute. The engines were directly outside, and then, cutting through the engine noise and the storm and the 3 a.m. darkness, Gideon's earpiece came alive with Raker's voice, slightly ragged, the edge of exertion in it, but present and functional, which was the only thing that mattered. Sniper is secured, Raker said. He's talking. You're going to want to hear what he says. Gideon looked at Carver. Who sent the sniper? He said. Carver's jaw was working. He's not mine, Carver said. And for the first time tonight, there was something in his voice that was not controlled, something that moved through the professionalism and landed on the surface as what it actually was, alarm. The sniper was not part of my operation. If someone dispatched a shooter tonight without my authorization, that means there's a principal above my operational level who decided this situation required a harder solution than I was authorized to deploy. He paused. His voice had gone carefully flat in the way voices went flat when they were trying to contain something that wanted to be larger. Which means I'm also a liability. The room was very still. Carver, Gideon said slowly. Who is above your operational level? Carver looked at him. And what was in his eyes in that moment was something Gideon had not seen there all night, through everything. The calls, the missed shot, the lost operatives, the completed transmission, the arrival of the formation. Fear. Clean, unmedicated, authentic fear. You need to understand, Carver said, that the people who commission the containment facility are not people who accept exposure. They don't negotiate. They don't withdraw. He looked toward the facility's exterior wall, toward the sound of the engines. Your formation outside is 176 people. The people I work for have assets that make tonight look like a disagreement in a parking lot. His voice had dropped. If your evidence transmission reaches the right people in federal oversight, and if Whitmore moves on it, there will be a window, maybe 48 hours, during which your brotherhood and this family and every single person who touched those documents tonight will be the most visible loose end in a very large operation. Gideon said nothing. I'm telling you this, Carver said, because I am now in the same position you are, and because the only version of the next 48 hours in which either of us survives is the one where federal jurisdiction is established completely and publicly before those people can move. The engines outside went quiet. The sudden silence was enormous. Then boots on concrete, the specific sound of men arriving, moving with purpose, the chain link on the loading dock rattling as Gideon's brothers found the perimeter, and voices, short and directed, the Iron Saint's particular vocabulary of action, and somewhere in there, cutting through it, Raker's voice calling his name. Gideon looked at Carver one more time, the man who had called twice to threaten him, the man who had set the conditions for tonight, the man who had killed, through instruction and through proxy, a veteran named Danny Hollow on a dark stretch of Route 12, and who was now sitting on the other side of a folding table in a facility built on stolen land, telling Gideon that the thing behind him was bigger than either of them. You're going to tell me everything, Gideon said. Every name above you, every contracted party, every asset you know about, and you're going to tell it to me and to Whitmore simultaneously, on the record, in the next hour, before whoever sent that sniper decides you're also something that needs to be cleaned up. Carver looked at his hands, then at the stack of schematics, then at the site map with its below-grade containment footprint and its classified annotations and its 42 acres of coastal land that had been purchased for a fraction of its value on a Friday afternoon in August, while half the county offices were running skeleton staff. He nodded. It was a small nod, very small, but in the specific geography of this night, in this room, with the engines cooling outside and the storm still running hard off the Atlantic, and somewhere 4 miles back, a 6-year-old girl sitting in a motel maintenance office with a crayon and a piece of paper. It was enough. Gideon reached across the table and picked up both phones. He looked at the schematic on top of the stack for a moment. The containment facility, its reinforced walls, its specialized ventilation, its purpose-built access road that would have replaced the bridge that Maisie Hollow had stopped 180 motorcycles from crossing. And he thought about Danny, who had followed this chain of evidence to the end of Route 12 and had understood, in the last days of his life, exactly what was being built on that land and exactly what it meant. He thought about what Danny had said to Maisie. My job is to be a protector. You have to help me finish it. She had finished it. She had walked barefoot into the headlights of everything her father couldn't stop, and she had made it stop. The door behind Gideon opened and Raker came through it, his jacket torn at the left shoulder and a cut above his jaw that was going to need attention, but his eyes were clear and his posture was the posture of a man who had completed an objective and was ready for the next one. He looked at Carver, then at Gideon. The sniper's name is Vale, Raker said, former DoD contractor. He was given 2 target parameters tonight, the formation at the bridge, and a secondary target he was instructed to activate if the primary failed. A pause. The secondary target wasn't Boone. Gideon looked at him. It was Maisie, Raker said. The word dropped into the room and everything went very still. Gideon's left hand, which had been managing its 60%, closed into a complete fist for the first time in 3 hours. The scar tissue pulling and the cold forgotten entirely. And what moved through him in that moment was not rage in the way rage usually moved through him. Not the hot kind, not the kind that needed to be controlled, but the cold kind. The kind that had no edge and no ceiling and no floor. The kind that had kept him functional in places where the hot kind would have gotten him killed. He looked at Carver. A 6-year-old girl, he said. Carver could not hold his eyes. From outside, more boots, more voices. The sound of the formation fully arrived, surrounding the building, the specific pressure of that many men organized around a single purpose. And inside the facility, the overhead work light was still burning over the empty metal chair with its cut zip ties, and the server rack hummed under its tarp, and the folding table held 11 months of Danny Hollow's courage in schematic form, and Gideon Rohr stood in the middle of all of it with his fist closed and his mind running at the cold, precise frequency of a man who understood, finally and completely, the full shape of what he had ridden into tonight. Not a land deal, not a corrupt commissioner, not even a classified facility on 42 acres of stolen coastal property. A system. A complete, layered human system designed to make the wrong thing invisible and the right thing impossible. And at the center of that system, the one person who couldn't be bought, or managed, or rerouted. A 6-year-old girl with gray eyes and her dead father's ability to see exactly what was in front of her, had been designated a target by men in suits in offices who had made the calculation that she was an acceptable cost. They had been wrong. He turned to Raker. "Get Whitmore on the line," he said. "Right now." Raker was already dialing. And outside, in the dark and the storm and the waning hours before dawn, 176 engines sat silent and waiting. The iron saints wrapped around this building like a fist, and the night was not done. Not quite. Not yet. But the shape of what came next had changed, and Gideon Rohr was the one holding the geometry of it, and he was not going to let go until every name above Carver was on record, and every person in his protection was on the other side of. Whitmore arrived at 6:47 in the morning with 4 federal agents and a forensic team that worked in silence and moved through the facility with the practiced efficiency of people who had been waiting a long time for the door to open. Gideon watched them from the loading dock, his back against the cold metal of the exterior wall. A cup of coffee that Dowd had produced from somewhere. A thermos, it turned out. The kind of man packed for a memorial ride because he was the type who thought ahead about warmth. And he stood there and drank it and watched the federal machinery begin to move around the thing Danny Hollow had died to expose. Carver talked for 4 hours. He talked in the specific, flat, exhausted way of a man who had decided that the only remaining variable in his future was the quality of his cooperation, and who had made the calculation that complete disclosure gave him the best odds in a situation where his own principles had designated him expendable. The names above him went up 3 levels. 2 were private sector, executive tier, the kind of corporate architecture that existed specifically to be several rooms away from the decisions made in its name. 1 was government adjacent, a contracted advisory role that provided access without the accountability of a title. Whitmore listened and recorded and said very little, which was the manner of a man who had learned that silence was the most efficient extraction tool available. The containment facility, Carver confirmed, was designed to store classified material. Not weapons, not prisoners, but data. Physical servers, air-gapped, below-grade, the kind of infrastructure that certain government-adjacent operations required. When they needed storage that existed outside the standard federal oversight architecture. The corruption was not incidental to the operation. The corruption was the operation, the mechanism by which the facility could be built and funded and never appear on any document that a congressional oversight committee might one day request. Danny Hollow had understood this. His notes hadn't named it explicitly, but the structural logic of what he documented pointed directly at it, and Whitmore, reading the 11 pages at 3:30 in the morning on a folding chair in the Harbor Inn, maintenance office, where Elena had finally agreed to let a federal agent read them, had understood it within the first 4 pages. "Your cousin was a methodical man," Whitmore said to Gideon at one point, outside the facility in the early gray light before dawn. "I didn't know him well enough," Gideon said. Whitmore looked at him. "You knew him well enough tonight." The sniper Vale was in federal custody before sunrise. The 4 contractors from the inn were transferred to federal jurisdiction. The local sheriff's department bypassed entirely by a jurisdictional order that Whitmore had prepared in advance, which suggested he had anticipated exactly this complication or something close enough to it. The Silverado and the black SUV were impounded. The encrypted radio equipment from the facility was seized and bagged. At 7:15, with the sky going pale gray above the Atlantic, and the storm finally spent and everything very still in the way, coastal mornings were still after a night of weather, Gideon walked back to the Harbor Inn. The formation was there. All of it. The ones who'd ridden to the facility and the 2 who'd stayed, all gathered now in the parking lot in the cold morning light. Some sitting on their bikes, some standing, some leaning against the building wall with coffee or cigarettes. Everyone quiet in the specific companionate silence of men who had been through something together and were still processing the shape of it. He walked through them. Nobody spoke. Hands on his shoulder as he passed, brief and solid, the Brotherhood's particular vocabulary of presence. Not words, never words for this. Just weight, just contact, just the physical fact of being beside someone when it mattered. He found Boone near the east end of the lot. Kara was with him. She was wearing Holt's cut over her sweatshirt because Holt had taken it off and put it on her shoulders without explanation, and she had let him, and she was holding a cup of coffee in both hands, and she was alive, and she was here. And when Gideon stopped in front of her, she looked at him with the clear gray eyes that were her grandfather's and her father's, and apparently the Rohr family's particular inheritance. "Thank you," she said. "Your father did the work," Gideon said. She nodded. She understood that distinction and did not try to argue it away. He looked at Boone. Boone stood very straight, the way a man stood when he was trying to take up the full space of his accountability rather than shrink away from it. His eyes were clear and completely devastated, and he did not look away. Gideon held his gaze for a long moment. "You know what's coming," Gideon said. "Yes," Boone said. "Brotherhood Council, full account, whatever they decide." "Yes." "I'll speak for the circumstances," Gideon said. "I won't speak for the choice." Boone's jaw tightened. He nodded once. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was the specific, complicated truth of two men who had been through something that could not be made clean, acknowledging each other across the distance of it, and choosing to remain standing on the same ground despite everything. Because the alternative, the complete severance, the erasure, would cost more than either of them had left to spend. Gideon put his hand on Boone's shoulder for 1 second. Then he let go and walked toward room 6. Elena opened the door before he knocked. She'd known by his footsteps, probably, the specific sound of his boots that she'd cataloged over the course of the longest night of her life. She was still in the oversized sweatshirt, her hair down now, her face carrying the particular rawness of someone who had not slept and had cried at some point in the last hour and was not trying to hide either of those things. Maisie was at the desk, drawing. She looked up when Gideon came in, and her face did the thing it had done on the bridge threshold, that adult assessment, that quiet taking of stock, and then it settled into something that was as close to peace as a 6-year-old's face got after a night like this one. She held up the drawing. It was crayon on a piece of Harbor Inn notepad paper. A parking lot, approximately rendered. A long line of small shapes that were clearly motorcycles. She'd drawn the handlebars on each one with careful individual attention. And in the center of the parking lot, one figure, small, with its arms spread wide. At the top, in large unsteady letters, the people who stopped. Gideon looked at it for a long time. Then he crouched down to her eye level and held out his hand. She put the drawing in it. "Keep it," she said. "So you remember." "I'll remember," he said. "I know," she said. "But keep it anyway." He folded it once, carefully, and put it in the breast pocket of his cut, over the iron cross, over the scar tissue, over the specific geography of everything he'd been carrying. Elena was watching him from the doorway. He straightened and looked at her. "There will be a process," he said. "Federal. It'll take time. Whitmore's people will need statements, yours, Maisie's, documented carefully by people who know how to do this with a child. Danny's documentation is now federal evidence, which means it's protected and on record and cannot be made to disappear." She nodded slowly. "The scholarship," he said. "The Iron Saints have a memorial fund. It's for families of veterans. It's not large, but it's consistent, and it'll cover Maisie's education when she's ready." He paused. "It was started for members who didn't make it back. Danny qualifies. The Brotherhood voted before I walked over here." Elena's eyes went bright. She didn't speak for a moment. "He would have liked you," she said finally. "He would have liked all of you." "He'd have given me a hard time about the bike," Gideon said. She laughed, surprised out of it, brief, real. It changed her face completely, made her look like the person she'd been before 4 months of motels and fear. And then the laugh settled and she was still that person, still carrying the 4 months. But the two things were in her face at the same time now, and that was different from before. At 9:20, with Whitmore's team still working the facility and the federal jurisdictional paperwork in motion and the local sheriff's department under a hold order pending an internal affairs review, Gideon walked back to his Road King. The formation was assembling. Not with urgency, slowly, with the unhurried gravity of men who hadn't finished business with the road and understood that some obligations didn't expire because the night had been hard. The memorial ride. 11 years without a break. The names on their vests were still owed what they were owed. Cortez pulled up beside him and idled. "We finishing it?" he said. "We're finishing it," Gideon said. He pulled on his helmet, sat for a moment with both hands on the grips, the engine warming under him, the cold morning air in his lungs with its specific taste of ocean and ice and the coming end of the storm. He took a breath that went all the way down. He thought about Danny Hollow at 22 years old, a man he barely knew, a branch of the family that had gone quiet, a cousin who had chosen the same direction, who had found the same instinct in himself and pointed it at the truth until the truth cost him Route 12. He thought about Maisie with her arms spread in the headlights. He thought about the drawing in his breast pocket. He thought about what it meant to stop. Not to hesitate, not to flinch, but to actually, deliberately, at cost, stop. To put the weight of your entire life between a moving thing and something it would destroy. And to understand that this capacity, this willingness, was not a character flaw or a liability or a wound from some earlier version of yourself that you hadn't managed to outrun. It was the whole point. He let the clutch out and the Road King moved forward, and the formation fell in behind him and they rolled out of the Harbor Inn parking lot onto the Harbor Road with the specific sound of 176 engines in formation. Not loud for the sake of it, not performance, just presence, just the mass of living men in motion, which was its own kind of language. And the morning opened up around them, gray and cold and entirely still now that the storm had moved on, and the ocean was on their left and the road was long and straight. And somewhere behind them, Elena Hollow was standing in a parking lot watching them go with a daughter who had her father's eyes and had already seen more of the world's sharp edges than most people saw in a decade. The ride completed just after 11 in the morning on a stretch of coastal highway where the guardrails were rusted and the pavement was sun-bleached pale and the Atlantic ran flat and dark to the east. They stopped for 90 seconds, engines off. The names read aloud by Cortez, whose voice was steady because 17 years of this had taught him how to hold his voice steady for the names even when he didn't want to. Danny Roar Hollow's name was not on the vest yet. Patches took time, required a vote, required the full ceremony of the Brotherhood's acknowledgement. But Cortez said the name anyway, at the end of the list, without preamble or explanation. Nobody argued. Then the engines came back on, one by one, the formation rebuilding its sound from the first bike to the last, until the full harmonic was there again, chest deep and certain. And Gideon Roar led them back toward the highway and the long road south, with a folded piece of notepad paper in his breast pocket and 4 fewer names in the living column of the world than he'd started the night with, and 1 name added to the list of people whose weight he was going to carry the rest of the way. It was not a clean accounting. It never was. But the road was open, and the storm was done, and 176 engines were running, and a girl was alive in a motel room behind them drawing pictures of the people who had stopped. And Gideon Roar rode into the morning light with both hands on the grips and the iron cross on his handlebars, catching the first pale sun of the day and throwing it back as something that was not quite brightness, but was, at least, not dark. It was enough. For now, it was enough.